Welcome to the School of Love, the place where miracles are normal. Hello and welcome to the School of Love, the place where we learn practical tools based on scientific research and our own experiences towards improving ourselves, living life to its fullest, and contributing to the best of our abilities to the world around us. I'm Dr. Maria Grajdian and I'm a professor of media studies and anthropology at Hiroshima University. In my free time, I am doing my best to guide you in building up a life of contentment, joy, and fulfillment while applying lessons learned in school to overcome the difficulties, challenges, and insecurities of the real world. In today's video, I talk about the animation movie My Neighbour Totoro, released in 1988 by the reputed Japanese animation director Miyazaki Hayao as his fourth animation movie and the second to be released with Studio Ghibli. My Neighbour Totoro was an instant success both with critics and at the box office and is regarded from nowadays perspective as a groundbreaking media product. I start with a brief introduction to Studio Ghibli and subsequently to Miyazaki Hayao, followed by a succinct but profound analysis of My Neighbour Totoro and life-sized replica of Mei Satsuki's house on EXPO 2005 site. By the end of this video, you will have a rather complete, I would say, understanding of Miyazaki Hayao's animation movie My Neighbour Totoro, as well as its significance within the larger framework of Japanese, respectively global mass media. My Neighbour Totoro creates family and the family house as an escape space by means of nostalgic reproduction with nature as main catalyst. In the absence of a full, deeply functional family, nature turns into a space of encounters where initiation trips occur and open the vast scene of new experiences for Satsuki and Mei. The two sisters discover in the unexpected encounters and challenging adventures the inner strength to overcome fear and annoyance and to move forward to accepting fresh emotions of belonging and protection. More than being a simple building in the anonymous countryside, the family house reveals itself gradually as a gate between universes. It connects and transcends them. The father, initially obviously overwhelmed by his function in balancing both work and an appropriate nurturing for his daughters, slowly but regularly finds his own position within the fantastic space in which his daughter immerses. The inclusion of an identical, life-large size replica of the family house from the animation movie My Neighbour Totoro among the international pavilions on the EXPO 2005 site resulted in the creation of an absolute highlight sightseeing, running booked off months in advance during the Expo. And after the Expo, the whole site eventually became a huge sanctuary for the preservation of nature, with Mei and Satsuki's house as a pilgrimage space in the center, in the midst of emerging housing projects, suffocating and gradually eliminating the natural habitat. Satsuki and Mei's house attracts tourists and locals in 10,000s every year, so that holidays and weekends are always booked off weeks in advance and working days running usually in an average of 97 capacity. Based on extensive fieldwork, interviews and participatory observation over several years, as well as in-depth literature research, this video's goal is to point out the intricate relation between nature, escapism, and happiness as main parameters in the process of reconstructing the past as a repository of emotional energy and social cultural role models beyond economic political compulsions, transcending the limits of time and space. Thus, it becomes obvious that the imaginary and the dynamization of its interaction with the symbolical and the real in Julia Kristeva's conceptualization from 1974 play fundamental roles in the creative re-evaluation of happiness as an individual choice within the framework of social cultural sustainability in late modern Japan. And now, first things first, that is, two important disclaimers. The first disclaimer serves to strongly emphasize the fact that this YouTube channel, The School of Love, is not part of my educational and research activities at Hiroshima University. It is nonetheless part of my privilege, joy, and sense of duty to propagate and implement knowledge, information, as well as motivation and inspiration outside the limited framework of academic endeavors. Together, we can build up a better tomorrow for as many of us as possible. The second disclaimer relates to the fact that I am a trained musician and musicologist, not a psychologist, therapist, or counselor. The ideas I am sharing in my videos reflect my deep preoccupation with life, my own life and other people's lives, and express the results of my experience, research, and for better or for worse, my failures, as well as my recovery from those failures, recovery which is still ongoing. The idea expressed in the videos on this channel named The School of Love cannot, may not, and must not replace the consultation with specialists in whichever areas of your life you might have questions or you might struggle with. If you are new to this channel at this point, I would like to ask you to please consider subscribing, sharing, liking, commenting. Thank you very, very much. This helps us not only with that mysterious algorithm which seems to dominate the YouTube galaxy, but also with contributing to the expansion of the community of humans doing their best to impact positively the world and those around them by discovering their authentic selves and living life wholeheartedly. Thanks again. Within the international animation landscape, Studio Ghibli has become, throughout the past almost 4 decades, a symbolic icon of successful Japanese animation, which emerges as a constructive combination of aesthetic ideological visions and consumption-oriented compromises. As the epitome of an impactful cultural enterprise dealing with the production of cultural assets, namely animation works, sometimes also known as anime, the Japanese version of cartoons, Studio Ghibli's productions stand out due to their strong messages embedded in the medium of visual imagery, both aesthetically reflecting the reality and ideologically tackling urgent issues such as environmental pollution, social discrimination, the process of growing up, historical responsibility, the meaning and value of life, or love as a complex emotional paradigm. Since its foundation in 1985, with a stable location in Higashikogane in western Tokyo, Studio Ghibli has turned over the decades into a symbolic institution of the Japanese entertainment industry. The name mostly associated with Studio Ghibli is Miyazaki Hayao, born in 1942, who has collected the most recognition, but he is in fact solely a member of what might be called the Ghibli Quartet, consisting of Miyazaki Hayao, Takahata Isao, Suzuki Toshio, and Hisaishi Jo. The founding quartet included Takahata Isao, Miyazaki Hayao, Suzuki Toshio, and Tokuma Yasuyoshi, with the last two serving as producer and manager respectively. The composer Hisaishi Jo came later to join the Ghibli enterprise after he was discovered by Takahata and Miyazaki when he presented the music proposal for the first official animation movie released by the newly founded Studio Ghibli in 1986, Laputa the Castle in the Sky. Nowadays, one can talk of the Studio Ghibli in terms of an expanding Ghibli corporation, with the Ghibli Museum founded in 2001 and located in Mitaka, Tokyo, which was projected and built under the supervision of Miyazaki Goro, Miyazaki Hayao's eldest son. A real-life replica of Satsuki and Mei's house from the animation movie My Neighbour Totoro, released in 1988, situated on the EXPO 2005 site in Nagakute, Aichi prefecture, designed by Miyazaki Goro as well, and a long-expected Ghibli theme park in Aichi prefecture opened in November 2022. Ghibli, written in fact G-I-B-L-I, means in Italian hot desert wind, and was supposed to have the effect of a fresh wind reinvigorating the framework of Japanese animation. Studio Ghibli was grounded, as I said, in the year 1985, mainly by the animation directors Takahata Isao and Miyazaki Hayao. Both grounders had already gathered experience in the field of animation and of the Japanese animation industry, which they subsequently employed in developing their own animation production company. Together with the so-called Takahata-Miyazaki combination, 2 more persons have been accompanying the Ghibli enterprise since its beginning and have been contributing to its astonishing success: the producer Suzuki Toshio and the composer Hisaishi Jo. Until Miyazaki Hayao's blockbusters released during the 1990s, his previous animation movies can be regarded as creative laboratories in which he experimented various aesthetic approaches and ideological positions by means of exploring the possibilities, boundaries, limitations, challenges, and freedoms of the medium. In Lupin III, The Castle of Cagliostro from 1979, Miyazaki employs the archetypical slapstick comedy as the framework for technical visual experiments of dynamic representations of movements in depth, as well as what would come to be seen as the prototype of post-war shoujo in Japanese culture in Clarice's character. In Nausicaa from the Valley of the Winds from 1984, Miyazaki extrapolates his preoccupations into the post-apocalyptic science fiction genre, quite in tune with George Orwell's dystopian novel, but pushing the boundaries of the animated orchestration of his visions further beyond what was customary at the time. One first climax in his exploration of the potentialities of animation as a representation medium which could transcend reality by expanding it without overwhelming audiences appears in La Puta, Castle in the Sky from 1986, where cyberpunk is employed as a narrative pretext for underscoring the dangers of technology while simultaneously introducing nostalgic undertones who would grow even stronger in his annexed animation movie My Neighbour Totoro from 1988. The release of the animation movie My Neighbour Totoro in 1988 marked the explosion of the so-called Totoro craze, visible in such phenomena as the enthusiastic reconsideration of the nature and of its real or fictional inhabitants, the revisiting of heritage trees as protectors and providers, seeking for the simplicity of life within nature as an escape from the over-sophisticated urban environment, the respect for the frugality of rural life while finding happiness in the rediscovered authenticity of myth, legends, and folkloric beliefs. A different side of childhood, as well as its crucial rites of passage, is presented in Kiki's Delivery Service from 1989, in which the concept of fantasy worlds extrapolates to a space similar to our quotidian reality and still somehow alienating in its very familiarity, a manner of relating to current historical events on the global stage, which will be reiterated in Porco Rosso from 1992, Miyazaki's first animation work which addresses the topic of war head-on. As later on represented in more profundity in The Wind Rises, war appears less than an inevitable but necessary evil and more like an everyday occurrence, which must be treated as such. Furthermore, in his monumental Princess Mononoke from 1997, Miyazaki employs the ecological pretext with its, at the time already tired superficial ecologist propaganda, to reflect and convey a much more powerful message, that of life being the most important asset one possesses and could ever possess. A narrative strategy utilized previously by his senior colleague and co-founder of Studio Ghibli Takahata Isao in Pompoko the Heisei Tanuki War from 1994. Then again, in tune with Takahata's preoccupation with the Japanese modern family and its obvious degradation in recent decades, reflected in his Ho Ho Kekyo, My Neighbors the Yamadas from 1999, Miyazaki explores in Spirited Away from 2001 the perils of materialism and immaturity as an existential attitude which forces children into parentification protocols when their own parents become unable to protect and provide for them. A huge parable in itself, Spirited Away was an impactful animation movie which seemed at the time to manage the breakthrough of the medium into mainstream entertainment, thus collapsing its traditional attached label of a kids-oriented language. Nevertheless, both Howl's Moving Castle from 2004 and Ponyo on the Cliff from 2006 mirror each in its own way the confusion of the era, resulted in Japan's case from its inability to recover from the so-called lost decade of the 1990s and to move forward politically and economically despite largely mediated propaganda discourses, and in Studio Ghibli's case from Takahata Isao's distancing from the enterprise's activities. Therefore, Howl's Moving Castle is both one of the most compellingly beautiful animation movies in the history of the genre and a model of content's emptiness, largely due to the superficiality of the plot and to the relative linearity of the narrative structure, which lacks the solidity of classical models. On the other hand, Ponyo on the Cliff is strongly reminiscent of My Neighbour Totoro without managing to revive its warm-hearted innocence and sense of awe, while still awakening the longing for vulnerability of childhood in an atemporal era when magic seems seamlessly integrated in the quotidian life and humans can peacefully coexist with other beings. Eventually, The Wind Rises from 2013 highlights some of the creative strategies such as emotional ambivalence, dynamic reconsideration of history, artistic highlighting of the spiral-like dialectics of cause and effect, employed by Miyazaki Hayao in his last animation movie, in order to point out the complex and intricate levels comprised by the phenomenon of war as media-related construction, as well as the unstable stress ratio between economic political systems and the social cultural individuals constituting those very systems. Thus, it becomes obvious that beyond being a historical appearance with apparently clearly defined levels of good and evil, war is a personal concern, deeply affecting individuals, both those directly involved and those marginally related, in their quest for love, happiness, and existential fulfillment. The animation movie My Neighbour Totoro, or in Japanese Tonari no Totoro, was released in 1988 by Studio Ghibli under Miyazaki Hayao's direction. It was a double release, together with Takahata Isao's The Grave of the Fireflies, or in Japanese Hotaru no Haka. They represent contradictory worlds in the midst of historical real-time and symbolical turmoils, seen from the perspective of children. Essentially, My Neighbour Totoro's plot deals with the incipient stages of the relocation process from city to the rural area of a small family of four: a sickly mother, the working father, Kusakabe Tatsuo, who is an university professor of archaeology, and two daughters, Satsuki, 8 years old, and Mei, 4 years old. They move to the countryside in order to be closer to the hospital in which the children's mother is recovering from tuberculosis. The action takes place in Japan at the turn of the 1960s, and the house the family moves into is a nostalgic combination of a run-down old mansion and a comfortable cottage, both in Japanese traditional style. Right from the beginning, this house plays a fundamental role in the gradual integration of the newcomers within the simultaneously familiar and fantastic environment of rural life, composed both of friendly, helpful neighbors and of magical, kind creatures. The release of My Neighbour Totoro marked the explosion of the so-called Totoro craze in Japan. This Totoro craze was visible in such social cultural phenomena as the enthusiastic reconsideration of nature with its real or fictional inhabitants, the revisitation of heritage trees seen as protectors and providers, the quest for the simplicity of life within nature as an escape from the over-sophisticated urban environment, the rediscovery of the respect for frugal rural life, as well as of simple happiness, and the re-authentication of myths, legends, and folkloric beliefs. My Neighbour Totoro recreates a life feeling and an existential mood of late 1950s and early 1960s. These are the so-called Showa 30s, named after the Showa period in Japan, which lasted from 1925 until 1989, which are the epitome of nostalgia in present-day Japan, with its all-encompassing, alienating strive for efficiency and progress in late modernity. There are several reasons why exactly this period of time, mid-1950s until mid-1960s, represents a nostalgic climax in Japan. Firstly, it becomes a couple of years after the cease of the American occupation, effective as of April 28, 1952. Secondly, it ends before the beginning of the so-called Golden Decade from mid-1960s until mid-1970s, which marked the international acknowledgement of Japan's rise as an economic superpower, while still lacking any major political significance on the global level. Such events, such as Tokyo Olympics from 1964, Osaka EXPO or Osaka International Exhibition from 1970, and the world premiere of The Rose of Versailles from 1974, staged by the Takarazuka Revue Company, accompanied this ascension, while negative occurrences such as the Minamoto disease in Kumamoto prefecture, officially recognized on September 26, 1968, and the first oil crisis occurring in October 1973, provoked by the OAPEC countries, played in the background as negative effects of worldwide economic development and its impact on political and social structures. The great epic of cuteness, the animation movie My Neighbor Totoro, reveals childhood and naivety as important initiation phases on the way to adulthood. The Totoros, whose name is derived due to Mei's unclear pronunciation from the northern trolls, are a combination of an owl, cat, and tanuki, or Japanese raccoon dog. From the latter, they also borrow their magical abilities. Generally speaking, their anatomy corresponds to the appearance of cute characters since early 1970s in Japan. They are asexual, round mammalian with big heads and huge eyes, which become even huger when they are surprised or scared, unable to speak, to run, to express themselves, or to defend themselves. They possess round bellies, very small and thick arms and legs, as well as minuscule mouth, or fully absent mouth, which, however, in case of necessity, appears suddenly out of nowhere. Later on, the Totoros prove to be beings from a fantastic world in which flying buses in the shape of a cat, the famous cat bus or nekobasu in Japanese, are invisible for grown-ups' eyes but greatly helpful for kids in need, in which seats can turn within one night into giant trees, in which the fear of a small child that his or her mother might die can meld the real and the fantastic world into one harmonious universe. For Satsuki and Mei, whose mother lies ill in the hospital and whose father is absent during the day, the Totoros are guides into the world of the grown-ups, companions on the children's way from uncertainty into the aware existence of being individual personalities. Thus, the Totoros show the children a way around the classical image of the necessity to repress oneself and to sacrifice under the pressure of the community or the society, and guide them on the pathway of discovery of unknown treasures and joys. The family house is, in My Neighbor Totoro, the space of mythical encounters between nature and culture, between past and present, where the future is being molded and humans can live in harmony with the universe. The quotidian life is enhanced by additional miracles, so that going to school, solving the household chores, listening to one's tutors are as normal as immersing into the dream and playing with a broken bucket. Cuteness becomes the precondition of a pure world, which does not disappear when adulthood is attained, but which is absorbed fully into adulthood. Insecurity, clumsiness, confusion are parts of the emotional dimension of the grown-ups as much as a healthy dose of self-confidence and a happy smile. Eventually, My Neighbor Totoro is a hymn of that part of the self which may not die within the process of growing up in the Japanese modern society as in the world at large, but begs to be kept alive within the adult spirit. The ability to watch one's life with honesty, love, innocence, courage, and confidence, simultaneously with the capacity to stay true to oneself and to the others in a world continuously on the move. Decades later, Miyazaki Goro, the eldest son of Miyazaki Hayao and the person deeply involved in expanding the Totoro brand beyond its animation-connected relevance, stated on the project of the life-size Satsuki and Mei house in Aichi prefecture. When I sit in the twilight bliss in the living room of the freshly finished Satsuki and Mei's house, there is both the feeling of directly immersing into the movie and the hallucination of being again in the house of my grandparents, which has been demolished. Within the mysterious mood incorporating both nostalgia and freshness, I fantasize that, who knows, maybe the pitch black assistants, or in the movie Makkuro Kurosuke, are observing me from the darkness. What Miyazaki Goro means is the fact that nature and the nature-surrounded family house was an escape space by means of nostalgic reproduction as a main catalyst within the environment. Family and their lodging place appears as a space for encounters and initiation journeys, as experienced by Satsuki and Mei in the animation movie My Neighbor Totoro. It is a gate between universes, not only the human and the animal or verdant world, but also between reality and dream, the possible and the probable, necessity and desire. The broken bucket and the archaic water well become tools, enabling the rediscovery of one's childhood, more often than not experienced as merely the product of a merchandised interaction between what Julia Kristeva has called the imaginary chaos and the symbolical order, preparing the self for the confrontation with the real. Indeed, 17 years after My Neighbor Totoro's release in 2005 on the site of the World Exhibition in Aichi, in short Aichi EXPO 2005, an identical large-sized replica of the family house from the animation movie My Neighbor Totoro was included among the international and corporate pavilions. More than previously estimated, this inclusion resulted in the creation of an absolute highlight sightseeing, running during the EXPO 2005, booked off months in advance. After the EXPO 2005, the entire site eventually became a huge sanctuary for the preservation of nature, with Satsuki and Mei's house as a pilgrimage space in the center, which was later turned into the Ghibli Park, open to the general public in November 2022. Ironically, around the initial Memorial Expo 2005 park, housing projects and emerging shopping malls increasingly suffocated and gradually eliminated the natural habitat, in a blatant contrast with the Expo 2005's motto, Nature's Wisdom, and Expo's mission, which gathered national and corporate pavilions expressing themes of ecological coexistence, renewable technology, and the wonders of nature and of living in harmony with nature. Still, Satsuki and Mei's house, as the life-large replica of the family house from the animation movie My Neighbor Totoro was named, continued to attract tourists and locals in 10,000s every year, despite the opaque and overcomplicate booking system of the entrance tickets, a problem faced when attempting to purchase entrance tickets for the Ghibli Museum in Mitaka, the upper-scale area of Japan's capital Tokyo as well, so that holidays and weekends were always booked off weeks in advance, while working days are running an average to 97% capacity. Satsuki and Mei's house on the EXPO 2005 site was initiated, projected, and brought into existence by Miyazaki Goro, a professional landscape architect and, most notably, the eldest son of the reputed animation director Miyazaki Hayao. Before pursuing the recreation of the life-size replica of the family house from his father's animation movie My Neighbor Totoro as Satsuki and Mei's house on the EXPO 2005 site, Miyazaki Goro was involved in the architectural design of the Ghibli Museum, or better known as Mitaka Forest Ghibli Museum. Belonging to Studio Ghibli and located close to Inokashira Koen, or Inokashira Park in Tokyo, Ghibli Museum was opened in October 2001 after several years of projects and preparations, with Miyazaki Goro serving as director from 2001 until 2005. Parallel to his activity as architect and landscaper, Miyazaki Goro directed 3 animation movies. 2 of them released by Studio Ghibli, Tales from Earthly from 2006 and From Up on Poppy Hill from 2011, and the computer-animated fantasy movie Earwig and the Witch, which was released in 2020 as a co-production between Studio Ghibli, NHK, and NHK Enterprise, which received generally negative reviews, particularly related to the computer-generated animation and the screenplay. In addition, Miyazaki Goro directed the television animation series Ronja, the Robot's Daughter, based on the eponymous children's fantasy book by the reputed Swedish author Astrid Lindgren, first published in 1981. Satsuki and Mei's house belongs to Miyazaki Goro's vision to expand the Ghibli enterprise in the public perception by means of practical projects, as it is Ghibli Museum as well, which is composed of 3 main exhibition areas besides a homey cinema and the main hall called the Principal. Ghibli Museum recreates in spotless details the atmosphere and the setting of the Ghibli animation works, and it transfers into reality their magical worlds. While providing technical information on the 3 main production phases, pre-production, production, and post-production of the animation releases, Ghibli Museum aims at the same time at familiarizing the visitors with the real universe of the animator's life, consisting of long and strenuous work hours. From this perspective, Satsuki and Mei's house is rather a poetical emergence into the nostalgic world of childhood, as opposed to the quite technical and distanced space of Ghibli Museum. Still, it is an extension of the Ghibli Museum, with its cat bus displayed in one of the secondary rooms, kids being allowed to play with it, and with its giant robot built on the roof of the Ghibli Museum, which comes directly from the steampunk universe of Laputa, Castle in the Sky. The exuberant vegetation and the beautiful view from that roof remind of the plain and familiar miracles of nature and are, in addition, a direct address to the forthcoming nostalgic reconstruction of childhood memories, as represented in My Neighbor Totoro via the identical, large-sized replica of Satsuki and Mei's house on the EXPO 2005 site. While projecting the real-life size version of the family house from the animation movie My Neighbor Totoro as Satsuki and Mei's house on the EXPO 2005, Miyazaki Goro repeatedly underlined the fact that he was not only trying to reproduce an animation release product into reality, but rather to recreate a life feeling, an existential mood of the late 1950s and early 1960s. Thus, Satsuki and Mei's house is not only a real life-sized copy of the animation movie artifact, but an emotionally and mentally safe space of encounters and returns, as experienced by Satsuki and Mei in My Neighbor Totoro. Therefore, until the visitor reaches Satsuki and Mei's house, one is guided through an artificially created labyrinth of increasingly intimate landscapes reproducing the primordial encounter between an innocent child and the wild nature. These landscapes include Japanese and alpine landscapes, leading towards a generous pond from over which the house becomes visible. Depending on the season, Satsuki and Mei's house presents itself both from the outside and from the inside in different atmospheres. In full blossom, highlighting the beginning of a new life chapter in spring, mysterious and seductive in summer, covered by the luxuriant nature, discreet and rather reserved in autumn, surrounded by impressive nuances of gold and red, quite cold and dismissive in winter. Best pictures can be taken during winter due to the lack of the leaves in the trees, which otherwise hide the house from distant views. Inside the house, the familiar atmosphere is created by the impression that its inhabitants have just left and are about to return soon, naturally. The shelves are filled with clothes in accordance with the season. There is also assorted food available in the kitchen, and the towels in the bathroom might as well have been used during the common evening family bath ritual, as visualized in the animation movie, which led in an initial phase to heated debates in the West as to age restriction. As spotted from mostly middle-aged visitors' conversations, entering Satsuki and Mei's house equals to a physical return into their own childhood, with metal lunch boxes and cotton underwear, often accompanied by tearful remembrances of one's own school days and teenager habits. Conversely, younger visitors, aged 25 to 35, proceed in pursuing the places where the Totoros might hide, and in playing detective in finding out the degree to which the building on the EXPO 2005 site reproduces its animated original. Teenage visitors often sit bored around or play on portable video games or with their smartphones, unable to follow their parents' enthusiasm, focusing on what a high school boy called a bunch of old smelly clothes. Though the clothes in the 1950s fashion aligning in the shelves are not smelly, while even smaller children simply prefer to imitate the characters featured in the movie, and thus to reproduce their imaginary universe while copiously entertaining their parents, mostly in their 30s. Satsuki and Mei's house turns, thus, into a space of recollection and self-discovery in the midst of a collective consciousness seldom expressed so clearly and spontaneously. From this perspective, Satsuki and Mei's house is an avant-post of the society of the future, which holds the essence of Furusato or homeland as a valid answer to such questions as what is homeland? A place, relationships, possessions, emotions. However, there are no universal answers related to Furusato or homeland as represented by Satsuki and Mei's house. For instance, a real home, neighborhood, or childhood's memories. The evocation of Furusato in case of Satsuki and Mei's house appears as Furusato Zukuri, or in English, the creation of homeland, the construction of homeland, in an ongoing political project to create common memories and means of social reproduction, while the longing for the past and the dissatisfaction with the present are employed to create an imagined, remembered community of abundance and emotional warmth in the future. As displayed by Satsuki and Mei's house, the Furusato Zukuri, or the construction of homeland, is supposed to integrate current activities and interpretations of the past and of past conditions within the construction process of an authentic preview of the future. Provided that human spirituality is a combination of geniality and naivety, of utopian daydreaming and prodigious spontaneity, which are limited, unified, sterilized in the process of growing up, Satsuki and Mei's house emerges as an oasis of calmness and security, full of nostalgias and mysteries, enabling the adult spirit to momentarily escape the contradictions, disenchantments, and insecurities of the current disturbed world, and to immerse oneself in an universe of friendly, warm, sincere, emotional exchanges and bonding. However, it would be a cheap generalization to regard Studio Ghibli and its animation releases as cultural paradises free from tension and contradictions and living on the production of cultural assets. Especially later animation works, starting with Howl's Moving Castle from 2004, illustrate the danger of high expectations and lurking artistic narcissism combined with increasing tendencies of cultural nationalism. Rather, Studio Ghibli is a further manifestation of late modern mythologies. As an efficiently working duo in spite of basically different personalities, the initial team composed of Takahata Isao and Miyazaki Hayao could revive in their animation works passion, love, and force, while searching for creative compromises with consumers' wishes and expectations without giving up their own ideals, according to the ideology of the late 1960s. As outposts of the so-called new globalization of Japanese animation, Studio Ghibli is still regarded as an antithesis to Disney. What this senseless East-West dichotomy oversees is the fact that Japanese animation is by far not a monolithic entity, but a dynamic conglomerate, which stays unpredictable in its diversity and plurality, similarly to the Japanese culture and society and with the global ecosystem at large. Thus, beyond being a cultural artifact released by means of the animated medium, Satsuki and Mei's house becomes a tool to create and convey feelings of longing and paradoxically belonging. Social affiliation is transcended as emotional belonging, translated in its turn into happiness as the chance to revisit one's own childhood with the eyes and the experience of the mature mind. Nostalgia is an invented emotion which allows for transfer of significance in historical terms, which leads again to social cultural sustainability as the result of conscious choices on the basis of everyday events and accumulated life experience. Social actors, as Pierre Bourdieu put it, grow into responsible, self-aware citizens. More than being a plain tourist highlight, Satsuki and Mei's house becomes, hence, a space where the childish imaginary confronts the mature symbolic and recreates the real as a site of responsible, self-aware happiness. This draws on the informal appearance of the Studio Ghibli as building an enterprise nurturing from its ample ideology of a coexistence with nature among equal humans. From the parking place with lots of bicycles and the entrance in the ground floor with a big Baka signboard, painted by Kato Tokiko, the voice actress of Gina in Porco Rosso. In the movie, Gina often tells Porco Baka, above the huge Totoro puppet, until the roof terrace with the roof garden and its mild vegetation. Passing through the 3 floors, the ground floor hosts the photo department. In the first floor there is the ink and paint department. The second floor is occupied by the animation and production as well as the press department, and the art department is located on the 3rd floor. Takahata and Miyazaki recreated the idealized memory of a serene world in which the classical principles of competitive undertaking were replaced by those of peaceful togetherness. Principles taken from an archaic nature, able to regenerate and live on eternally in full plenitude. Continuing and expanding Studio Ghibli's ideology and aesthetics of a pacifist world respecting the value of human life, Satsuki and Mei's house proved that imagined nostalgia is a basic element in the comprehension process of its own popularity. More than the animation movie from which it stems, Satsuki and Mei's house is itself an active visualization of an imaginary past, which was never experienced as such and which leads to a real practical configuration of the desired object through the gradual processing of emotions. On a more abstract level, it is the maternal semiotic subversion of the paternal symbolical order which conducts within a highly intertextual context of extremely stylized imaginaries to the ideal of an impossible femininity. On the other hand, Satsuki and Mei's house appears as nostalgia for the present in its display and location, as there is the active attempt to construct childhood, nature, and femininity as a cute adventure within a spatial and temporal framework where it could have never possibly existed. As a consequence of this process, the past turns into a place of imagined communities and impossible identities. The past is now not a land to return to in a simple politics of memory. It has become a synchronic warehouse of cultural scenarios. The ideologized representation of distance, painted in temporally and spatially nostalgic colors, leads to the emergence of grotesque representations of the self and of the other. Especially the feminine self, as a cute appearance, emerges as a never-to-be-attained entity which nurtures the mechanisms of nostalgia infinitely through its symbolical absence within the male discourse. This mechanism is practically displayed through the euphoric contemplation of the future and through the emotional compilation of scenarios to access reality through the nostalgic endeavor. Recent work on political culture in Japan shows that the state and major commercial interests have done a great deal to construct and energize the discourse of Japaneseness and of tradition in an effort to exploit the idea of Japan as the repository of a unique, homogeneous form of cultural difference. Therefore, the imagined nostalgia and the illusory remembrance crystallize in this process as eternal sources of aesthetic longing. The ideal of Furusato as displayed by Satsuki and Mei's house and by its animation version in My Neighbour Totoro reminds of the intellectual nostalgia present in Charles Baudelaire's poem Je n'ai pas oublié from the cycle Les Fleurs du Mal, and his consciously constructed ideal of a homeland. However, the Furusato Zukuri or homeland construction and the imagination of primordiality as represented by the Totoro phenomenon underlie a complex dialectic and resemantization process. A specific version of the self is created, being composed both of an experienced past of historicity, materiality, and warm intimacy, and threatened at the same time by feelings of fear, virtual homelessness, loss of orientation, and loneliness. Conversely, Satsuki and Mei's house represents romantic, idealized, post-nostalgic forms of love and belonging, and emerges as a powerful instrument to redirect quotidian nostalgias. Romantic fiction is surely popular because it restores the childhood world of sexual relations and suppresses criticisms of the inadequacy of man, the suffocation of the family, or the damage inflicted by patriarchal power. Yet it simultaneously manages to avoid the guilt and fear which might come from that childhood world. Sexuality is defined firmly as the father's responsibility, and fear of suffocation is overcome because women achieve a sort of power in romantic fiction. Romantic fiction promises a secure world, promises that there will be safety with dependence, that there will be power with subordination. It is a complex, self-delusional process based on visual representations within which contradictory feelings of an imaginary nostalgia of a never-experienced past and of an impossible future are accumulated. Various forms of sublimation and repression of an alienating present are generated, propagated, and implemented within the playful concatenation of images and sounds, of real memories and virtual thoughts, of familiar ideals and distant ideologies. Ultimately, Satsuki and Mei's house effuses that form of nostalgia which originates in the identification with an apparently forgotten past, providing the feminine ideal as a spatio-temporal forgotten self. Desires of virtual visualizations of this forgotten self within an intertextual carnival-like framework are implemented. Through the nostalgic display of gendered memories, social control, and on a more collective level, strategies of cultural imperialism, Satsuki and Mei's house recreates on the EXPO 2005 site a space of national erotics as repeatedly individual nostalgias. These ideologically displayed erotics of remembrance produces human characters who, in turn, lead to new forms of control and categorization of self-perception and self-representation. A direct extension of its original animated version My Neighbour Totoro, Satsuki and Mei's house on the EXPO 2005 site fills the emotional space between honest remembrance and imagined nostalgia. Thus, on the one hand, Satsuki and Mei's house represents the childhood's family house as a space of social cultural encounters. The fictional creatures living in the forest, the neighbors in the village, and the familiar landscape, including the well and the bucket, are a healthy return to the safe world of Furusato or homeland, mediated by water and grounded by ancestral trees. On the other hand, Satsuki and Mei's house recreates the childhood's family house as a space of economic political development, transmitting a sense of protection and security in times of upheavals and transformations. Finally, Satsuki and Mei's house reminds of the necessity to construct the childhood's house as a center of self-discovery, of learning and education, where the imaginary is a tool leading to the symbolic and the real dimensions of adulthood. In doing so, Satsuki and Mei's house rewrites postmodernity as an unifying sign and a paradoxical prefecture, where the dissolved form and the nonsensical contents are not perceived as liberation, but as a version of ennui or jadedness, which both mystifies nostalgia and induces escapism as generalized mal du siècle. While nostalgia and escapism are basic assets of emotion precariousness in times of confusion and distraught, they might as well be romantically painted ideologies. Unreachable, impossible love turns into a life goal because happiness and a fulfilled existence are boring within the dynamic framework of the consumption society. Nostalgic remembrance, even when only imagined, moves the soul, not the vivid, fresh presence of love. Simulation takes the upper hand, and nostalgia is merely a phantasmic, parodic rehabilitation of all lost references. Simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being or a substance. It is the generation by models of a real without origin or reality, the hyperreal. It is no longer a question of imitation, nor of reduplication, nor even of parody. It is rather a question of substituting signs of the real for the real itself. That is, an operation to deter every real process by its operational double, a metastable, programmatic, perfect, descriptive machine which provides all the signs of the real and short-circuits all its vicissitudes. God himself has only ever been his own simulacrum. Whereas representation tries to absorb simulation by interpreting it as false representation, simulation envelops the whole edifice of representation as itself a simulacrum. As symbolically represented by Satsuki and Mei's house, escapism is a combination of nature, religion, and the mythical world, leading altogether to the creation of an imaginary nostalgia for an imagined past. It is the reflect-like emotional movement of a world having been modernized too fast, which had jumped from a medieval premodernity directly into postmodernity, ignoring most phases of a healthy modernity, passed through by most Western nations, nowadays categorized as highly industrialized, service-based postmodern societies. Realism proves to be merely an emotional artifact. In the Japanese classical visual arts such as emakimono, which is the illustrated horizontal narration system of painted hand scrolls dating back to Nara period in 8th century, and or ukiyo-e, which translates literally as pictures of the floating world and refers to the woodblock prints and paintings which emerged and flourished during Tokugawa period in Japan between 1603 and 1868, which are continued by anime, which is Japanese animation art, or cartoons and manga, which are Japanese comics, as well as in the classical stage arts such as No, Kabuki, and Bunraku. Realism refers to plot, characters, and the handling of these parameters. The realistic plot is enhanced by the dramatic processing. The quotidian reality and the prevalent worldliness are rescued by a new form of warm humanism. Thus, the representation of social limitations and the tragic conflict between obligations and emotions, between outside and inside, transforms the historical generally valid human model into a contemporary human drama, and the historical characters into normal human beings, driven by feelings and passions. The plot moves away from the general political, philosophical, historical field of classical art into the practical domain of the realist display of everyday life. The abandonment of an idealized correction of reality shifts towards the acceptance of the reality as such and towards its realistic representation. The great characters of human types abstractly represented as striving for transcendence are highly individualized, being replaced by realistic characters. It is the process of artistically stylizing the ideal of the real individual, possessing an extremely conflictual personality and an increasingly symbolical function. The transcendent emotions are sublimated into human feelings, including hopelessness and lack of orientation, with seldom rays of joy and fulfillment of the dreams. New forms of perception and self-perception are developed. The inner ambivalence, the tragic conflict between social obligations and one's own feelings, between economic power and social contempt in pre-modern visual and theatrical entertainment genres, anticipates the post-Meiji subject and the modern highlighting of the uniqueness of every individual caught in a complex network of diachronic and synchronic relationships. In this train of thought, the form-based structure of any modern entertainment genre in Japan, from enka, that is Japanese traditional popular music, until anime and manga and television variety shows, is reminiscent of the kata-oriented design of the Japanese pre-modern arts and literature. Predictability as a nostalgic reaction to the intensive changes on the background of Japan's frantic industrialization since 1868. The hybrid realities of today's Japan, multiple border transgressions and transnational exchange in the field of commerce, aesthetics, ideology, and science and research, are assimilated within hegemonic discourses on cultural purity and undifferentiation, as well as on nostalgic references to premodernity. The most disturbing is the attempt to culturally reconfigure the fears of modernity through rationalizing technologies, individualizing practices, and totalizing apparatuses. This reminds of Bakhtin's concept of dialogism, which is based on the argument of radical otherness, which cannot be acknowledged until a constructive, not necessarily direct dialogue as liberating clash between different discourses occurs. This discursive dialogism, a permanent interaction of meanings. The word, the discourse, the language, or the culture are subjected to a dialogical process as an alternative at the point in time of their relativization and liquefaction, is vividly included within the romantic communication attempts between visitors and the fantastic world represented by Satsuki and Mei's house, as well as its fictional inhabitants. During the production process of television animation series such as Heidi, the Girl of the Alps, 3000 Miles in Search of Mother, Anne of Green Gables, Lupin III, Future Boy Conan, Sherlock Holmes, during the 1970s, both Miyazaki Hayao and Takahata Isao acknowledged the fact that their ideal to create high-quality animation works to reflect the human existence with its joys and losses within the limited framework, both in terms of financial and temporal availability of the television industry, would forever stay a mere dream. The foundation of Studio Ghibli made their dream come true, so that they could regard every animation work as an entity in itself. Their task would ultimately be to go on keeping the balance between commercial success and own aesthetic values according to the motto, make a movie. If it has success at the box office, make the next movie. If it fails, that's the end. The production of good animation works was the most important task. The extension of the production site was regarded as a side effect. Indeed, by developing high-value animation works with a general human message, the financial success became a natural side effect. Despite the fact that both Miyazaki and Takahata repeatedly highlighted the idea that the Japanese audience was their main target, with a specifically Japanese message to bring over to that very Japanese audience, even though several of their animation works is inspired from non-Japanese sources, in time, animation works released by Studio Ghibli became international blockbusters. The identity dialectics in My Neighbour Totoro and its real-life reflection in Satsuki and Mei's house proves that reproductive nostalgia and historical escapism cannot completely annihilate the covert longings of those Japanese citizens touring to the EXPO 2005 site to find again an apparently lost past. This is again a reminder of the fact that, though intensively pursued by Japanese politicians and strategists during the Meiji period, not only technologies and institutions of Western capitalism were imported, but also centuries of aesthetic theories, literary forms, and social representation modi within a record time frame. Not only railways technique, but also Enlightenment ideology, not only financial capital, but also Renaissance worldview, not only Prussian militarism, but also British humor. Within the unbalanced power spectrum between Japan and the West, innumerable phenomena of intrusion and resistance, of seduction and assimilation occurred. Still, the really profound meaning of the era directly following the Meiji Restoration consisted in the construction of the modern nation-state, with the simultaneous transgression of dynamic worlds of representation and thought within the existing indigenous system. This eventually resulted in the veritably subversive activation of the semiotic constellation of the pre-Meiji Japan. Satsuki and Mei's house on the EXPO 2005 site is, from this perspective, not a modifying repetition of the family house in the animation movie My Neighbour Totoro, which utilizes in its circular citability the argument of tradition until its very exhaustion as self-confirmation and self-validation. Instead, it appears as the postmodern reflection of the fact that power, freedom, and justice as principles can help create a more human world, maybe less perfect, but warm and peaceful in its playful familiarity with childhood memories and emotions. So that would be from me for today. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening to me. And as always, I'm looking forward to welcoming you here very soon again. Love and peace to you all.